Strike one, strike two, strike three. Illinois' credit rating takes a hit. That's coming up next on Capitol View. Credit analysts are worried about Illinois' ever-growing bill backlog and the structural deficit as it grows. Also, top leaders, their war of words escalates. We're going to talk about all of that on this week's edition of Capitol View. I'm Amanda Vinicky, the State House Bureau Chief for NPR Illinois, WUIS in Springfield, and joined today by two of my dear friends, some of the smartest folks that we have in the Capitol Press Corps, including Jordan Abudayyeh. She is with WICS Channel 20 in Springfield, and then we have the Springfield correspondent for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin, Andy Maloney. So thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so let's actually begin with this war of words between Governor Bruce Rauner, who I'm going to say he started it. He went on the offense, and once the legislature didn't send him a budget, began this tour starting downstate up into Chicago, and it seemed as if he had been being quiet throughout the latter portion of May in terms of the budget, trying to say, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, and then before midnight on May 31st, that had changed, and it has gone up and up and up in this crescendo ever since. So, Jordan, can you give us a sense of what it is that Governor Bruce Rauner is saying? And is this just kind of the same rhetoric that we've heard since really he became governor, or is it different now?
I think you're right. His rhetoric has really ebbed and flowed depending on what was happening. So I think in those last couple weeks of session, we did hear him toning down that rhetoric completely, a lot of cautious optimism. He was going to wait and see if we can get that grand compromise. And then once that grand compromise was obviously not going to happen, a total shift.
He unleashed.
Yes. And it was very much the same rhetoric we heard at the beginning of session last year. You know, his first try to get a budget passed with some of his reforms, a lot of calling out the Chicago machine, the corrupt, Madigan.
Literally calling the leaders corrupt.
So yeah, he's not mincing words here at this point. Sounding very much like a campaign. I think people are aware that we are in the middle of a campaign cycle. And so, yeah, the rhetoric is getting intense. And I think what you hear from Democrats, what you hear from critics alike, no matter what your party is, can you really put out that kind of rhetoric? Can you say those insulting things to the media, put all of the blame on Democrats, and then sit down at the table with them and compromise? When we grilled the governor this week, I think when he returned to Springfield after this tour, I don't know if he was expecting the press conference that took place. You know, a lot of the reporters in other parts of the state only see him rarely. And so questions, I think, tend to be a little easier for him to answer. They're more broad. But when he comes back to Springfield, people who cover this, 24/7, we know. And so I think he was caught a little off guard this week when he did have to answer multiple times to the criticism of, can you actually get something done with these people that you are insulting directly in the media and to everyone's faces?
Well, and it was interesting because the governor had two responses to that, or three, I guess, depending on how you look at it. One of them was that I'm never going to apologize for calling out what I view as corruption. There was that. Then he said that it's also a matter of, yes, the tone is too harsh. We should scale it back. Then he said that we should be able to be harsh and talk at the same time, walk and chew gum, aka work out a budget at the same time as we're campaigning. And then on the fourth hand, he said, all right, if the Democratic leaders can't deal with this, grow up. We're all adults here. So it was a lot to stomach. Andy, do you side with him on all of the above, or does he need to pick an A, B, C, or D?
I think all of those arguments, in a way, are beneficial for him. I mean, as to whether we side with any particular ones, I think we see perhaps strands of things, because I think if you'd asked him, he would say, well, and others would say the Democrats have no problem with coming after me, making floor speeches, going into press conferences and
Although
and
I
blasting
would say
him.
that the Democratic leaders have made a point, it seems, of being measured in their
Well,
criticism.
and I think the other difference too is that they are doing it sort of in the normal course of action, at least as far as Springfield goes. They come to Springfield during session, they're talking about particular bills or issues, kind of along those tracks, right? Whereas the governor is planning, sort of these campaign-style tours, as they call them, and going out and sort of bashing them in the media as, like a President Cullerton would say, while his working groups are trying to get something done. It's not helpful. We've seen a sort of a study in different styles where Speaker Madigan, of course, for the longest time has just talked about, the number one issue being the deficit and kind of adhering to those talking points, being sort of a strong, silent type. You have kind of the dry wit of President Cullerton and saying, I want to get a deal done. I want to congratulate the governor on winning the campaign 2014 because he never officially talked to me after he won the election in 2014. But then you have the governor, like you said, who's made, not making any apologies for overtly criticizing his political opponent. So you have different styles there, and to an extent, I think you could argue that he is sort of, throwing all of those things against
Trying
the wall.
to have the best of all worlds.
Seeing what sticks, exactly.
And it comes at the same time as the governor has given a lot of money to the Republican Party. The Republican Party, in turn, has already started with campaign ads on TV, online. I mean, the campaign has started, and while you can't directly say that that's Bruce Rauner's money, you can take a really quick walk around the block to get there.
Right, and again, I think while the Democrats have come back and said, they're using this quote of his that crisis creates opportunity, and he was trying to force this crisis. I think his response to that is, this isn't my crisis. You guys put us in this crisis. I mean, how many times have we seen, for instance, this same storyline where a credit ratings agency comes out and says political gridlock, a bill backlog is causing serious economic harm, so we're downgrading this state. I mean, that's been happening since before this impasse, but I think it's gained even more urgency now.
Okay, so let's actually go back to this crisis creates opportunity. This is something that the governor said before he actually had the title of governor, when he was in editorial board asked about it, and that was, it seemed, his roadmap for getting past a controversial agenda that he knew Democrats weren't going to swallow easily. This was, it seems from his own statements, the method of getting there. Make some cuts, big cuts perhaps, and Democrats won't be wanting that to go forward. They will therefore give in and compromise, or maybe even just wholeheartedly adopt the agenda. Democrats are now turning that on him as Illinois is in a crisis. Jordan, what happened when the governor was asked about that?
When he was asked about it, he gave a very quick, succinct answer. This is not my crisis, and I did not create it. That is something that I think is up for debate. It's more of a chicken and an egg debate. The governor was then the governor-elect, and he asked the General Assembly to let the temporary tax increase roll back. He had to, when he made that decision, know that that was going to leave the budget very, very short for that current fiscal year, and then even shorter the next fiscal year. And so, that was a decision that he made. He's been asked if he regrets that decision before, and he said no. And so, did that start the crisis? Did that really get the ball rolling? That depends on who you ask. But I think from the governor's perspective, he thinks the way that the state's been run for decades has created this crisis, and that this is the tipping point we are at. But budgets have always kind of been implemented despite political beliefs or any sort of crisis that have come up in the past. And so I don't know who gets the blame here, and this is essentially the blame game. And I think this is the governor's point, that it's going to come down to what the public thinks. If there's pressure from the public one way or the other, Democrats or Republicans know they just have to win the war of public policy, and that's it.
Well, and it's been an interesting crisis because the governor says that the speaker and Democrats are really trying to make it a true crisis in withholding money for government operations. And despite his words saying, I'm going to cause a full crisis, really his administration has done all it could to keep things going as if Illinois did have a budget. So Andy, can you talk about that? And part of this is also the Attorney General. She's part of this war of words. She's been pretty darn silent, but the governor's bringing her into it.
Right. So the governor contends, and I think a lot of folks around the State House will believe that part of the reason that this hasn't gotten solved is because state workers are still being paid. There was litigation last summer as to whether they should continue to get paid. The governor made it a point of his to go around and say, I'm not going to let state workers not get paid for the work that they do. They're still going to show up. They should get paid for it. The Attorney General, at least initially in that litigation, said this isn't a continuing appropriation. In other words, it can't go forward unless the legislature passes appropriations for it. For lack of time to describe all of the moves in that litigation, basically some lower courts said, for now, make them continue to get paid. Keep putting the money out. And it's been like that in other arenas too, maybe not as high profile, but the governor's office has had to deal with these consent decrees that keep certain programs
Deal with
funded.
or locked out by them, perhaps.
Right, and as they say, very often, a lot of these are left over from different administrations, and they kind of have to maintain them sort of in a ministerial fashion. But I think the state worker pay is the main pressure point, and since that wasn't initiated, since those workers have still been paid, and we haven't seen, with the exception of maybe the one day where AFSCME and a lot of labor unions came and marched at the Capitol, they're still going to work, and it feels sort of like a soft lockdown, I believe is one of your colleagues, Brian Mackey, sometimes says. So that's a big reason why the impasse has sort of felt a little bit different up till now.
So is the governor right when he says Attorney General Lisa Madigan is trying to force a crisis with her father, obviously House Speaker Michael Madigan, or, I mean, there haven't really been a monster court filing. What is the governor talking about? Is this more just swinging a bat?
I think perhaps the implication is things that are, talks that the public or his office aren't privy to. Mm-hmm. But for now, at least, there was some talk that a more recent Illinois Supreme Court ruling might force the Attorney General to go back to court and say, well, now the Illinois Supreme Court has ruled again that certain appropriations can't go forward unless there is a state budget. So now we have to stop paying them. There's been talk that she's going to do that, but she hasn't done that. So it doesn't seem like there's any explicit action on the AG's part to kind of make that happen.
Mm-hmm. And then all the meanwhile, Illinois' bill backlog is growing. So state legislators have missed their paychecks for a couple of months now, not because they're not getting paid, but they're at the end of the line, as are many of the businesses that provide services to the state. That's where you do have Governor Bruce Rauner saying that there's a threat of a real shutdown if, say, a vendor that serves a prison or a veteran's home gets sick of it and says, I'm not getting paid, I'm no longer going to deliver the goods, provide the electricity. Comptroller Leslie Munger held a press conference to really lay out where things are at and pointed out that, all right, we've got these consent decrees, that will keep on going. But if a budget, temporary, full, anything, isn't passed by the end of this month, all of these stopgap measures that were reached on a bipartisan basis last time around, they're off the table. So, Jordan, what is included in that, and does that mean that we're going to get more of a real crisis, a real shutdown?
Well, these bills came about as people started realizing that there were certain segments and populations that weren't getting their money. One that got a lot of attention was lottery winners. We couldn't give lottery winners their winnings if the money wasn't appropriated, so the General Assembly took care of that. But then also some human services. Colleges eventually got some stopgap money.
911 call centers.
911 call centers, things like that. And so as they realized that certain people were not going to be paid under some of these court orders and consent decrees, they came together and they passed temporary spending plans without the governor's turnaround agenda attached to them, as the speaker will constantly remind you. And so these things passed, but they only last for the fiscal year. And so the General Assembly left without passing any sort of budget. No education spending plan, no budget like they did last year that the governor vetoed, and so we're basically back at square one. So if we go back to July 1st, we've got nothing. We have court orders and consent decrees, but that is it. She has no authority to pay anything else.
$23 billion that she won't have the authority to pay, and of course, however, in a sense, that's all money that is contributing to the structural deficit that Illinois continues to build ever since the tax increase went away in January of 2015. Leslie Munger is the face of this, and yet she was appointed by Governor Bruce Rauner, says she still stands by his agenda. She, of course, is in an election herself, a special election against Democrat Susana Mendoza. Is this putting her in a better position because she can say, I'm fighting for you. I made legislators wait to get paid. Or is she going to suffer no matter how much money the governor pours into her campaign fund? Because, again, she's the face of this backlog in a sense of the budget.
Well, she's certainly ringing the bell in terms of saying this is a crisis. This has to be dealt with. The legislature and the governor need to pass a budget. Schools won't open if we don't get an outsized chunk of that $23 billion you mentioned is K through 12 education, obviously, which is its own pressure point. But she did do what I think is a pretty politically popular move in delaying the legislators' paychecks.
Not popular with them.
Right, not popular with them, but with everybody else. And as we haven't seen any sort of legal challenges to that, it kind of
could there be?
Kind of puts the legislators in a tough spot. I think there could. I think you'd have grounds if you really wanted, but it'd be a tough
in what
sell
regard?
To get
our legal expert here. In what regard? Give us a quick.
So what she
note.
basically did was put them in the end of the line, right? And if you can sort of come forward and make your case in court that the paychecks. There's nothing holding them back from being paid. I think that could be a viable action, but I don't think anybody wants to do that. No legislator wants to complain about not getting paid while plenty of other people who are voting.
Complain to their friends.
Right, in public.
Right.
Let's put it that way. But that is obviously a politically popular move. I think she's done a certain job of kind of at least trying to remain, in a sense, distanced from the politics, from going out and overtly bashing Democratic leaders. She's kind of said, everybody needs to fix this. This is a big problem for everybody. Talking about the presidential politics, she declined to endorse Donald Trump. She says she's not going to the Republican National Convention. So she shied away in a little bit of a ways from the party politics, but still made some savvy, I think, moves that are intended to help that re-election effort.
I also think because her predecessor, Judy Topinka, was such a personality and so separate from the party itself that she has a tough sell to people. I think her coming out and saying, I understand, I feel your pain, vendors, I'm trying to pay you. I think that does sit well, and I think her canceling the paychecks and doing those things, that sits well with people. But I don't think her coming out and saying we need this turnaround agenda, as she's done multiple times, in order to help balance out the state's deficit spending and all of this. I don't think that's going to help her in the election. She doesn't want to tie herself to Donald Trump, as many Republicans don't, but I don't know right now in Illinois if you want to tie yourself to the turnaround agenda either.
And in general, getting attention to that race, I mean, this could be about the only time that we talk about it from now until the general election, really, when you have people caring about local races and, of course, the very top of the ballot with president and also U.S. Senate race that got a lot of attention. We will get to that because Mark Kirk made a little bit of news this week. But first, as I noted, 1, 2, 3 strikes. Is Illinois out? Not yet. But you had first Moody's, then S&P, and then finally Fitch, all downgrading Illinois' credit. Talked about this before, and it can sound kind of blah, who cares? But it means that it costs the state more to borrow. That means more money for taxpayers. And really, it's just kind of a measure, a thermometer of Illinois' fiscal health that is seen by outsiders. And wow, were some of these agencies direct in their reasoning behind this, saying that top leadership just can't get it together. Is this going to change anything, Jordan?
I don't think this changes anything. I think everyone's pretty dug in their positions at this point, but we've heard Senate President John Cullerton actually mention this before. I remember him mentioning this to me last summer when I talked to him. The governor has billed himself as the pro-business governor. He's going to turn this state around and this business climate to attract more people and jobs here. And does something like a downgrade on our credit do that? Does that achieve that goal? And this is the balance that I've been trying to figure out, and I asked the governor this week. At what point does the budget and the lack thereof become the most important factor in the business climate in the state? And I think, the downgrades and them pointing directly to the lack of a state budget and the deficit spending, I think that kind of kicks it up a few notches. I mean, when does the lack of a budget override workers' compensation and local control of collective bargaining and prevailing wage? Things that you claim you need to make the state more business friendly. When I asked the governor this week if he had solid numbers, I mean, are your reforms going to pay off in the end? He didn't have an answer. He was happy I asked the question, which I don't think that he understood where I was going with it. But the idea that we're going to rack up all this spending, we're going to ravage the state's finances, deal with a downgrade in hopes that this turnaround agenda in the end is going to be worth it. And I think from the governor's perspective, he hasn't come right out and said it, but I think he thinks it's a worthwhile fight because we wouldn't be here at this point. And so a downgrade, I think, only helps the Democrats a little bit in this sense.
And as to whether it changes anything, I mean, you saw the response, and it was the same response that we've had every single year.
Let me actually read this real quick, Andy, and then I would love your input here, but I have the press releases we have from the governor's office. Every rank and file Democrat who blindly followed the speaker down this path is directly responsible. From the Illinois Republican Party, Mike Madigan caused this downgrade. And then we got a quote from House Speaker Michael Madigan, who said that it is Governor Bruce Rauner. I mean, they are pointing their fingers directly at one another. And it is not the other people, it is Madigan v. Rauner.
Right, and while there was that added bit in the speaker's press statement about we've got these working groups that are making some progress or trying to make progress, it's still, I mean, like I said, we've heard some of that rhetoric throughout the last year, and even a downgrade, which, remember, during the pension crisis, people were going crazy over. We're still not getting sort of any, at least overt, changing of positions on that.
Well, I want to ask this question because I know you're a prolific reader, and it seems to me like we can harken back to Cold War days of the theory of mutually assured destruction. Why is that not working here?
I think you can get into a lot of philosophy, and my knowledge of Cold War politics isn't perfect. But that is kind of what this is. I think both the leaders on both sides know what a problem this is. I don't think there's any way that they're not aware of a lot of damage being done. But at this point, if you're the governor and you've said, this is our strategy, we're going to get these reforms, and this is going to be the hill that we fight the battle on. If you, in that position, I would think that if you've done that for over a year and had this much happen in that year period, it'd be hard to then say, well, nope, I was wrong. I'm going to give up on all this stuff. Right, and where the speaker said, I'm not giving up on a principle that middle-class families are going to be harmed because they're going to be harmed by the turnaround agenda. I just think when you've been making that point to so many people for so long, that is the definition of sort of being dug in.
Well, and a big part of this fight is education funding that continues, be it how much money should go to schools, how Illinois distributes money to districts. Jordan, the governor, on part of his tour, has really tried to make this about CPS. He called some Chicago public schools, compared them to prisons that were crumbling, making this really a Chicago versus downstate. Is that going to resound with downstate voters?
I think the idea that you always put Chicago in a bad light does resound with downstate voters, I think the Chicago versus the rest of the state rhetoric plays very well. But you do have a lot of downstate schools who are struggling financially, just like CPS. It might not be due to the mismanagement of money like CPS, but you have a lot of downstate schools who don't do well under the current funding formula. They want to see changes. And I think Democrats have really seized on this moment to create a change in the school funding formula that would also help Chicago. Chicago needs help. I think everyone realizes that, but Republicans were very stern from the beginning of session that they do not want to change that formula until after we get a budget. And so it's almost like the Democrats have turned the education funding reform into their turnaround agenda. And so now it's like we've added one more thing on the pile of we're not going to agree. And so how much money goes into schools, what formula that goes into, how that happens. I mean, these are big questions that now we have 3 weeks to answer before we start the fiscal year.
Right, all of this as a stopgap budget session. House Speaker Michael Madigan saying it doesn't do nearly enough for social services, bipartisan working groups meeting behind closed doors to discuss this. And we don't really have any indication yet of whether or not there will be a temporary budget. Former Governor Jim Edgar, who it seems Governor Rauner has no use for anymore, but Edgar saying that he doesn't think that that's a good way to go in the sense because it kicks the can down the road. We didn't have the House come in this week, although Madigan had said they were going to be in every Wednesday. Session canceled. He said it's because the working groups are making progress. But is that a sign that they aren't? And I mean, does it look bad that they're not back in Springfield as the governor is clearly trying to make that point?
If this is going to be a battle of optics, which has been from the beginning, then yeah, it looks terrible that they're not in Springfield because everyone who doesn't pay close attention to state politics knows they're not at work. And if I don't show up to my job, I don't get anything done. And so while working groups still met, lawmakers were in Springfield to attend those working group meetings. You know, those are things that take place behind closed doors that the voters and people whose opinions you're trying to win cannot see. And it's easy fodder for the governor to say, I asked them to be here. He said they were going to be here. He went back on their word. Look at the Democrats who don't want to even come to work and try and compromise. So I think, you know, in the political game, you have to think about both sides on that. And it doesn't look good from, I don't think, any perspective.
And we have a very brief bit of time left, but just Andy, real quick, we have U.S. Senator Mark Kirk running for re-election against Democratic Congresswoman Tammy Duckworth. Kirk saying that he is no longer going to support Donald Trump, won't vote for Trump for president. Good political move, and was it politics or was it real?
I think it is a good political move for him, and it may or may not work. We'll see.
All right. Well, there we go. Speaking of Congressman Aaron Schock, who has not been indicted or charged with anything, did make an appearance back in Washington, D.C. on the floor of the U.S. House this week. And check out our Facebook page for more on that and whatever else is going on in Illinois politics. That's CapitolView Politics is the page. Thanks so much to Chicago Daily Law Bulletin reporter Andy Maloney and to political correspondent for WICS-TV, Jordan Abudayyeh. I'm Amanda Vinicky with NPR Illinois. Thanks and see you next time.